As Jesse said, my name is Colby Hales. I originally am from Laramie, Wyoming, and now I am currently the ag teacher and FFA advisor at Pinedale High School in Pinedale, Wyoming. A little bit of background, and I know a couple of you guys have been on these last week, but so this might be a little repetitive. But for those of you who have not heard my spiel, my background is I grew up showing livestock, actually all species. And specifically hogs, cattle, and sheep, and as well as horses. And throughout that, was a very active member in 4-H and FFA. Went to Casper College for my associate's degree, received an associate's in animal science. And then I, from there, went to Colorado State University and got a degree in agriculture education. And then after that, went on to the University of Wyoming. And as Jesse said, I got to help coach the judging team there at UW while I was pursuing my master's in animal nutrition, specifically ruminants. We studied all species, but ruminants was kind of my specialty. And so hopefully we learn a little bit tonight. This presentation that I have for you guys tonight is going to be relatively pretty darn basic. And so this is kind of geared towards those of you who are kind of new to understanding ruminant nutrition. And pretty just baseline level things. So Jesse, do you have anything else before I go ahead and start screen sharing?
I don't think so. I guess if I could just ask the few people that joined after I first asked everyone, if you haven't already said where you're from in the chat box, that really helps me track what where all we're reaching. So if you guys could do that. But other than that, nope, the floor is all yours.
Perfect. Yeah, keep on typing, guys. Feel free to type in the chat box the whole time. Like Jesse said, I love getting asked questions. And so that actually helps me kind of determine where this goes. And so my little thing went away here. There we go. All right. So we'll get rolling here. I guess I'll actually start by putting this up here too. For those of you who at the end have further questions for me afterwards, feel free to call my cell phone or even shoot a text or shoot me an email. I'm kind of an open book as far as receiving questions. And so you feel free to jot down that info, and I'd be happy to share whatever knowledge I can help with. And so with that being said, and we'll go back to this here at the beginning, but that being said, we asked the question, what is a ruminant animal? And so actually, if everybody wants to type there in the chat box, tell me what a ruminant animal is. What is a ruminant digestive system? Weird, it won't let me look at the chats this time.
I can read what people are saying if you want me to, Colby.
Oh, okay, here we go. I got it back up now. Yep. Perfect. You guys are right on. Absolutely right on. Okay, to start, a lot of people want to say that a ruminant animal has 4 stomachs, and that is not right. You guys are already on top of the ball there. And saying that it is a ruminant animal has 1 stomach, just 4 different compartments. And I will tell you, I kind of nerd out over ruminants a little bit because they are really, really neat creatures, and we'll kind of get into that. And specifically, I encourage all of you that have the time and the opportunity to kind of get on Wednesday as well to that advanced session. We're going to talk about exactly kind of how the rumen works. Like I said, today's going to be relatively baseline, basic stuff, but ruminants are pretty fascinating. One big thing with ruminant animals that's quite a bit different than us or other monogastrics is we digest food through enzymes. We use enzymes to digest food. Ruminant animals use microbes. They have little bugs in their gut that actually digest those particular feedstuffs and actually make something new out of them. They're incredibly fascinating. Like I said, we'll get into kind of the details of that on Wednesday, but Yeah, ruminants are cool beasts. They're actually quite a bit more efficient at digesting a lot of different things that we can't digest. That's how cool they are there. Okay. Again, some of the kind of the basic stuff that we're going to base everything around here tonight are we got to start right at the baseline of what are the 6 classes of nutrients. Okay. When we start talking about nutrients, and where I'm going to kind of take this a little bit, is water, and that is absolutely baseline, the most important nutrient that an animal can have, any living being can have. All the rest of them do not matter without a sufficient supply of water. So for those of you that are feeding your particular ruminant species or your projects in general, make sure clean, fresh water is in front of those animals at all times. That's incredibly important. And then from there, we talk about proteins and lipids, or other words, fats, and then carbohydrates, and then vitamins and minerals. All right. All those help your projects grow. And so with that being said, we'll kind of move into kind of what we can expect out of these projects. All right. And so we're going to, you'll have to kind of bear with me a little bit here tonight. We got a lot of things to go over. And so I broke it down into cattle, sheep, and goats. And then towards the end, and this was absolutely my fault, I kind of forgot to add rabbits as well as some horses in there. They are not ruminants. I'm just putting that out there right now. Not ruminants, but they are a little bit different than they are a monogastric species. But we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. They're a little bit more complex than what necessarily us would be. But anyway, as far as what you can expect out of your beef project, as far as an average daily gain, that's a pretty wide range of pounds a day there, 2.5 to 5 pounds a day. Cattle they're actually pretty darn, what's the right word there? I mean, I guess flexible in how much those cattle can gain, and especially depending on genetics and breeds specifically. When it comes to, some of these breeds, particularly continental cattle, let's say like your Charolais and your Simmentals and Limousines and things of that nature, those cattle are bred to grow quite a bit faster than what necessarily our British breeds would, like Angus and Shorthorn and Herefords. Now, that's not to say Herefords if you are in the right genetic line, those cattle can grow and start to push up towards that 5 pounds a day range. I would say roughly our average is going to be about 3 pounds a day. All right, is what we can easily expect, especially for these show steer projects that are getting fed a pretty high concentrate diet, so on grain. And so those cattle will start to push up more towards that 3.5 pound range, and that's what we should expect out of those. The other thing to keep in mind is average feed to gain ratio, or feed conversion ratio, is about 6 pounds of feed to 1 pound of gain. So for every 6 pounds of feed that we feed those cattle, we would expect them to gain 1 pound a day. All right. And so we're actually we're gonna do some math here after the next 2 slides. We'll come right back to this. But so what to expect from a sheep project? Okay. Depending on what kind of feed and how hard you're feeding, again, we're going to expect these market lambs to gain right about 0.7 pounds a day. Our market lamb projects that are on a high concentrate diet and we're pushing them to make weight for county fair, like I said, we're right about that 0.7 pounds a day. That's what we can easily expect. And then as far as a feed conversion ratio, we need to feed those sheep about 4 to 5 pounds of feed to gain 1 pound of body weight. All right. And so if we put that into perspective, and this is one thing that I do not have on this slideshow, I have an example related to cattle, but we'll talk about it when we talk about sheep. We need to be feeding these sheep anywhere, between about 2 to 4 pounds a day, especially right now. Right now, we need to be right about that 2.5 pounds a day mark for these cattle, for these sheep to be on track. As we start to push and get old, or these livestock get older, that's where we start getting up into that 4 pounds a day range, because we want them to eat approximately about 2% of their body weight. Approximately. That's kind of a rough number. You'll start to understand as I go out through this presentation. I'm a very, very big advocate of feed to make your animal look the best. So understand when I give you guys these numbers as far as how much to feed, so on and so forth, they're rough numbers. You need to feed what makes them look their absolute best, especially once we start talking about these show projects. But once we go to goats, okay, we can expect those goats to gain anywhere between 1/4 pound to 1/2 pound a day. I would shoot right in the middle there once again for a pretty solid average of about 0.35 to 0.4 pounds a day. That's a pretty realistic number that you can target. Um, and then past that, once we start talking about feed conversion, again, we're about 6 pounds of feed to 1 pound of gain, and that math about works out for what we would normally feed a goat. They're pretty darn similar to sheep, and that's actually how I'll kind of design this lecture a little bit. Is we'll talk about sheep and goats kind of collectively to an extent throughout this, but the one part that we're going to talk about here, as far as how much you can expect to feed for these different projects, and this math, this is what I was talking about earlier, where I didn't put it for sheep and goats. I just put it for this example geared towards cattle. The math still works out the exact same. Or actually, no, I apologize. We're going to get to that here in just a second. This is talking about weights. Again, the math all works out the same. So I'm going to explain it more so on the cattle side, and then we'll kind of zoom through the sheep and the goats again, because the math will still work out. But, I'll let you guys kind of do the math here a little bit in your head. If you buy a market steer project on September 20th and it weighs 500 pounds, what will it weigh on July 28th if all things go correctly during that feeding period? That's about 312 days. So given the math or the numbers that I gave you earlier, go ahead and type in the chat box your guess on how much that steer is going to end up weighing at the end. I'm definitely going to judge your spelling there, Brooklyn Plum.
You know, I have never been a speller, like, ever. And so, you know, like, those are some pretty difficult words. And so, yeah, I was a little concerned, but it's okay.
Hey, you spelled them right.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Wait, A plus to me. Oh, I didn't spell don't right. You would think that'd be the one word I could get right.
That's right. Oh, except for Abel Mason. That's all right.
See, I figured there would be something.
All right, we're getting some very good answers in here. Excellent. Yes. Very good job. Okay, so if we go do our math here, 312 days till our endpoint show. And this will also help you. I put this math up here. Obviously, for those of you that might have a steer project, I sure hope you've already selected that project. And so this might help you in the future to make sure you're going to make that ideal weight. And so obviously, I'm a big advocate of selecting quality, but it's also very, very important that you get an animal that's the right size to where you'll have the ability to show those livestock. But anyway, at 312 days till our county fair, 3 pounds of gain a day, that's 936 pounds of gain. And so then we add that 500 pounds to our 936 pounds of gain. We would expect that particular steer to weigh about 1,436 pounds at our endpoint show. And so we'll go over here and do same thing with the sheep and the goats, just to kind of give you rough numbers here as far as what you can expect those particular sheep to weigh, as well as goats when you purchase these projects. And so I did the same dates outside of March 20th. You buy this Marketland project on March 20th, and it weighs 60 pounds. What's it going to weigh on July 28th if all things go correctly? Got a couple answers coming in here. Yeah, we're darn sure on the right track there. Absolutely. You guys are doing a good job here. Okay. And so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So we have 130 days within that feeding period. And I'm a little bit of a pessimist. And so I always like to err on the side of them not gaining overly great. And so if we go on the lighter end of that 0.5 pounds of gain a day, that puts us at 65 pounds of gain plus 60 pounds when we bottom. That sheep we can expect at the end to be about 125 pounds. Hopefully, though, we can push closer up into that 0.7 pounds a day, and we'll be a little closer to that 130, 140 range would be the ideal thing. And so that's kind of rough numbers there, but you guys are doing a good job as far as that's concerned. Again, I won't make you guys do the math on this one here, but if we buy a market goat project and it weighs 35 pounds when we get him bought, times 0.25 pounds a day, again, erring on the side of caution, that's 32.5 pounds a gain. If he gains a quarter pound a day, that puts us at roughly 67 pounds at our endpoint show. All right. And so that should help you in the future as far as how you can expect, how big you can expect your project to weigh when you buy them. So hopefully that particular information helps. Now, this math that we're going to go to next, this is the one that I just derived just towards cattle. Again, the math all works out same. So for those of you with sheep and goat projects, you can do the math the exact same. So how much feed should we expect to feed? And one thing that I do, you see the disclaimer there, all of these feeds are different. We're actually going to talk about that as soon as we get done with this math portion. All the feeds are different. And so you cannot expect necessarily, these need to be just rough numbers, all right? Help with budgeting and things of that nature. And the reason that I say all feeds are different is, for instance, if you have a market lamb project right now, you're going to start them either on, they might have been on on creep feed. And so that's a pretty high protein feed. We're getting quite a bit of skeletal growth out of those sheep. But as soon as you start reaching closer to your end point, you might drop the protein down in that feed to where they're necessarily not having the same amount of growth and they're putting on more fat cover than anything. And so I wanted to put that in there. These are rough numbers to kind of help you budget throughout your project. All right. And so if we expect a steer to gain 936 pounds, like the example that we had before, if we go through and do that, this number here, we expect, again, that feed conversion ratio of 6 pounds of feed to 1 pound of gain times 936 pounds of gain. That puts us right about 5,600 pounds of feed that we can expect to feed that particular steer. All right. And we go 5,600 pounds of feed divided by 312 days that we expect to feed that calf. We're at 18 pounds of feed a day. And again, those are kind of rough numbers there because obviously at the beginning when they are that 500 pound range, they're not going to be in a ton, or they're going to be closer to that 14, 15 pounds a day, right about. But once we start pushing them into the fall and especially into the winter, those cattle need to be quite a bit closer to the 20 pound, even upwards of the 23, 24 pounds a day range. And hopefully by the time we get to our ideal endpoint, those cattle are eating about 25 to 26 pounds of feed a day, depending on what kind of feed you are feeding. And so hopefully that averages out to be roughly 18 pounds of feed a day.
Hey, Colby, before you move on from that really quick, Brooklyn had a question that goes along really good with that there in the chat box. She said, how much less will a lighter/younger calf gain than a heavier/older calf, or will it stay pretty consistent? So I didn't know if you wanted to answer that. Seems like a good time to do that, maybe.
That is a great question. Good question, Miss Plum. So if we think of those lighter, or specifically, I'm going to relate it more so to those younger cattle. Younger cattle are going to gain essentially what it kind of does. If you ever look at the chart, and actually I challenge all of you to do this just because it's kind of interesting information to have. I challenge all of you to actually graph out how your cattle gain or how your project gains in general, because typically it's going to be kind of a nice little bell curve in the sense that they're going to gain somewhat kind of slow there right off the beginning. And then let's just say for a market steer project, we buy those cattle in September when they're 500 pounds. Again, at that point, we're kind of on the uphill slide. We're starting to get those cattle to gain quite a bit. They're on a high protein diet. They're growing fast. And then, and especially once we get into the winter, those cattle are trying to stay warm. And so they're, again, eating quite a bit more. They're gaining very fast. They're trying to put on essentially fat just to try to keep their body temperature regulated. And then once we start to get into early spring and especially into the summer, once it starts to warm back up, those cattle will actually start to gain quite a bit less. And I actually have a table here on, I believe it's actually the next slide, that I think will help kind of illustrate that quite a bit better. But yeah, essentially, they're going to grow real fast, into the fall and especially into the winter. And then they're going to kind of hit a little bit of a peak, if you will, to where, even if those cattle in the winter, let's just say to put numbers to it, they might be gaining that 4 to even 5 pounds a day. And then once it starts to get hotter, those cattle are quite a bit fatter. They're getting closer to what I would deem their slaughter weight. Those cattle, their gains are going to start slowing down into that, 2.5 to 3 pound range there once again. But that's a great question. I hope that answered it. Again, hopefully on this next slide, it'll help. Or I think it's actually 2 slides from now, if I remember right. Okay, and so when we go into this, as far as I probably titled this slide the wrong way, as far as what type of feed should I be feeding, I would actually more so deem it, what needs to be in that feed depending on their age and depending on just their maturity and how they look. And so most livestock feeds are known by their protein content, as far as what we call them. Let's just say a finishing diet with cattle is going to be around a 12% protein as compared to our creep diets and even some of our growers. Those are going to be more between like a 14 to even somewhere upwards of like an 18 to 20% protein type ration. And it's the same thing with sheep, same thing with goats. For those of you that tuned in last week on Monday, hogs especially. And so that leads me into my next question here. Besides water, actually protein is one of the most important nutrients to get livestock to grow, especially when they're young. All of them are important, but protein is very, very important and highly needed when they are young in order to get enough grow up in height and scale. And so with that being said, a lot of those grower diets, like we talked about, are going to be that 18 or between that 14, 18% protein for cattle. And then when we start talking about sheep, we're talking upwards of 17, 19%. Same thing with goats in that particular regard. And so we'll go through and kind of look at some tables here. And so, Brooklyn, back to your question. If you look at this average daily gain column here, you can see as we start moving up throughout weights, okay, those cattle are going to actually, and I know this is kind of a hard chart to read, and so I'll explain it a little bit here. When we start looking at these individual weights over here on the far left-hand column, and then we have lots of different rows here, okay? This is a table that's put out from Oklahoma State University, really, really good paper. If any of you guys want to read it, it's I think they just actually call it nutrient requirements for beef cattle. But they have it outlined that this is a pessimistic number here when they're not eating a ton. Their intake is quite a bit lower. We're looking at that 0.8 pounds a day upwards. Once we get into if you're really trying to push these cattle to get fat and grow, they'll be upwards of that 4.7 pounds a day. But anyway, as we start going through here and we look at protein content, okay, at 770 pounds, if we're really trying to push these cattle to grow, you can see we're upwards of that 18% protein, okay? And that's something that's important to look at in your feed tags. When it comes to show steer projects, here is my personal recommendation. When they are younger, well, let me put it this way. The difference between show steers and what I would deem as just our kind of typical beef steers that are headed towards the feed yard, those production steers that are just going to head towards the feed yard, they actually get docked if they're a little chubbier as babies. When they're bought headed towards the feed yard, they do not sell for as much. And the reason for that is those feeders want them to be big. They want them to have a lot of skeletal growth and to be kind of tall. Fat deposition will actually kind of curve their growth a little bit and slow them down to an extent. And so if you're really trying to get a lot of skeletal growth and trying to get those cattle tall, you might not hurt to have that upwards of 16 to 17, 18% protein. Now, for these show steers, and especially for those of you that might jackpot these cattle, specifically going to like Denver or even Phoenix and some of those early shows like that, you probably don't want to be up that high in terms of protein because they won't put on the same kind of body and fat cover early on and bloom, okay? And so we want to be lower, closer to that 14% protein range to get those cattle to where they still will grow. They'll still have some skeletal growth into them, but they're still putting on a little bit of chub. And as we move on here and we see, let's just say we're getting up into that 1,000-pound range, you see we have a 12.8% protein when we're really trying to push these cattle. Most of your finishing rations for these show steers will be right about that 12.5% protein. I think the number that I have right on top of my head is if you ever look at Purina's feed tags, their finishing touch, which is their finisher ration, is a 12.5% protein. And so their goal is trying to get those cattle to body down and get fleshy and fat. And so hopefully this chart can kind of help you as far as crude protein content of what you can expect personally for a show steer project. You need to be kind of looking at this very bottom row from each of these columns and what you can expect to feed those cattle to get the optimum endpoint result. You notice on here as well, there's not a crude fat column here. The reason for that is if you look up here, these two columns right here, that stands for net energy. The NE, that stands for net energy. And so unfortunately, in a lot of these feed tags, they actually don't have energy. And that's almost even more important than fat because cattle get energy from more places than just fat. Because if you think about where a majority of the energy comes from in a particular feed, we're talking very heavy starches, carbohydrates like corn, and things of that nature. And so corn, distiller's grain. And so energy content takes into account not only just fat or lipid content, but also total energy from also proteins and carbohydrates and everything of that nature. And so that should give you a pretty good indication of what energy can look like. And I would actually even ask if you know somebody who's actually milling your feed, ask them. It's kind of an interesting thing to find out. And then the other thing that I think this chart can help with here quite a bit is as far as what you can expect to feed those cattle as far as how much. Once we start talking about those 1,000-pound calves, kind of relates back to Brooklyn's question. That's when they're at their kind of peak intake. And so, mind you, this is not just feed. It's dry matter intake, and so that's taking into account hay and things of that nature. So it's not necessarily 26 pounds of grain. That's taking into account hay and everything else. As far as just opening up a bag of show feed at 1,000 pounds, you are going to be looking at about that 20 to 23 pounds of feed range because there's still some moisture content in that feed that adds to that weight. This is just dry matter. All right. And so it's, if you were to take all the moisture content out, that's how much those cattle should be eating. So hopefully that chart makes a little bit of sense. Again, if anybody has any questions related to that, be more than happy to answer that. But we'll go ahead and kind of move on through sheep and goats here. Okay. This isn't quite as heavy of a table here. When we start looking at, and what I mean by that is it doesn't necessarily break down protein requirements and things of that nature. Sheep are actually pretty easy in the sense that their protein content is going to stay pretty similar. And a lot of the reason for that is if you compare sheep and cattle, we want them to get fat. We want them to get big because we like marbling, okay? And we like body, and we like rib in steers, okay? Sheep, we need them to stay pretty lean, because I don't know how many of you have ever had sheep and goat fat, but it doesn't taste very good, okay? And so we want them to stay pretty lean. And so most of our sheep feeds are going to be upwards of about 18%. I will tell you one thing that I didn't mention in my bio is my family runs a pretty small club lamb deal. But our creep feed is, I would think, an 18%, and then our grower is a 17%. And we actually keep our sheep on that the entire time. Unless we need to just kind of start adding a little bit of fat cover or something like that, we can drop that protein content down just a little bit. But we keep protein up pretty high in both sheep and goats just to keep them lean. And also, we like tall sheep and goats. And so it gets them that extra bit of skeletal growth, which helps quite a bit as far as our ideal endpoint look and quality when we take them to our show. Okay? And so that's more so this whole chart right here. This is more so what I wanted to talk about as much as anything is that, 15 to 18% crude protein, I would side more so there with that upwards of that 17 to 18%. And actually one thing that I do want to talk about here is one question that I get quite a bit in relation to these show projects is why would we spend the extra money to feed a show feed? Okay. The reason that I am such a big advocate of a show feed is mainly because they're easy. Okay. They are a complete ration, a complete feed, doesn't take any thought. Somebody already did the thinking for you. And plus on top of it, their vitamin and mineral packages within those feeds are quite a bit more dense than what we would necessarily feed, a commercial cow that we turn out just to be a mom. All right. Quite a bit more nutrient dense and can maximize the genetic potential that these projects have. Right. And so that complete mineral and vitamin mix, pretty darn important there. No matter what you're feeding, you have to make sure you're hitting their needs. We'll talk about that a little bit more there on Wednesday. Okay. And so with that being said, that's really about all I have for this. I wanted to keep it relatively short. One, because I talk a lot. And two, wanted to leave enough time for some questions. Like I said there at the beginning, we're going to go more into detail on Wednesday of kind of how some of these things work. Just wanted to get kind of some base level information out today. But so with that being said, does anybody have any questions? And I think you guys can turn on your mic now if you'd like to ask these.